In mid-2024, as she grew increasingly critical of the Biden administration and increasingly involved with the Trump campaign, Tulsi Gabbard noticed changes as she went to the airport. She had more screening, federal agents with dogs showing up for her flights. Other federal agents followed her on the plane and reported back on her activity. When I learned of this, I launched an investigation into the TSA's Quiet Skies program and the Biden administration's weaponization of watch lists against everyday Americans. Under public scrutiny, the Biden administration removed now Director of National Intelligence Gabbard from the program, but they spent the remainder of their time in office stonewalling any investigation. Thankfully, that era is over. President Trump himself, a victim of government weaponization, set out to reverse the previous administration's targeting of the very citizens it is sworn to protect. Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem has taken decisive action to eliminate bureaucratic obstacles resisting transparency. We are finally getting answers. And now we know exactly why the previous administration fought so hard to keep us in the dark. Director Gabbard was surveilled on at least 5 domestic flights by federal air marshals under quiet skies. Internal records for her targeting show her congressional portrait and that she was a former congresswoman from Hawaii. So there was no doubt they knew who they were monitoring. Multiple concerns were raised internally, and one air marshal asked a colleague, why the heck is she a quiet skies suspect? If this can happen to a combat veteran, a lieutenant colonel in the Army Reserve, and now Director of National Intelligence, it can happen to anyone. And it did.
Before we dive in, I want to remind you to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a discussion that challenges the mainstream narrative and fights for truth. Your support helps us keep bringing these conversations to the forefront.
Today, for the first time, you will hear directly from a federal air marshal whose wife was labeled a domestic terrorist simply for engaging in protected First Amendment activity. Records show the FBI labeled her as a domestic terrorist for unlawful entry into the Capitol on January 6. But she didn't enter the Capitol. She came for a public support of the president, and they knew it. Her phone location data did not put her inside the Capitol. Facial recognition did not identify her inside. She had no criminal record and no history of extremist views. What they did know is that this Catholic school teacher from Texas supported President Trump and went to Washington to attend his rally at the Ellipse. That was not enough for the government. That was not enough to label her a suspected domestic terrorist. For 2 years, her family was surveilled when they flew. This was not an isolated case. It happened to hundreds of Americans. It happened because the TSA used First Amendment protected activity as a predicate for watch listing Americans. That's unconstitutional, of course. First Amendment activity cannot be the sole basis for watch listing someone, but sole basis is an important caveat, and it's an opening the TSA exploited. Today, we will release internal TSA records that reveal how the agency authorized First Amendment activity to be used to justify the surveillance of Americans with no evidence and no recourse. Using broad and vague authorities, TSA deemed hundreds of Americans as threats to national security simply for holding opposing political views. The federal government used its investigative authorities, anonymous tips, and university research institutions to build a flimsy case to put them on the watch list. They didn't just coincidentally watch list hundreds of people who attended the same Trump rally. They did it intentionally and obscured the process to create plausible deniability. For example, documents obtained in my investigation reveal that TSA relied on data collected by the George Washington University Project on Extremism. Consider this. First, DHS funds the Project on Extremism, an external partner not bound by the same laws and regulations as federal agencies. Then, the Project on Extremism identifies supposed domestic threats by meticulously tracking January 6 defendants. DHS then uses the Project on Extremism reporting as evidence, sometimes the only evidence for putting someone on a watch list. But the abuses weren't limited to January 6th. The TSA also viewed skeptics of COVID mandates as threats. Simply removing a mask on an aircraft got 12 Americans watch listed. Records also show 3 current members of Congress, all Republicans, were included in the companion Silent Partner program, either as a sitting member or while seeking elected office. A cursory review would have revealed them to be either a member of Congress or decorated active or former U.S. military members. In fact, they were surveilled likely for activities that were official duties during their time in the military or in Congress. All of this was wrong, and I'm glad that these abuses are beginning to be exposed. I commend Secretary Noem for ending Quiet Skies, but our work is not done. We must make sure that this program does not come back under another name. Every official who directed or approved surveillance of Americans for protected speech must be removed from office. Full transparency must become the rule, rather than requiring a year of investigation. The result will be a process that respects the Constitution, ends real-life shadow bans against Americans, and gives all of us the assurance that our government is focused on protecting us, not on chasing political ghosts. I now recognize the ranking member for his opening statement.
Well, thank you, Chairman Paul.
Now let's get into it. What we are looking at here is yet another example of how federal power has been weaponized against everyday Americans, not for criminal activity, not for actual security risks, but for their political views. This is the dangerous legacy of the so-called Quiet Skies program and the broader misuse of federal watch lists. Take a moment to think about what happened to Tulsi Gabbard. She is a combat veteran, a lieutenant colonel in the Army Reserve, and a former member of Congress. Yet, under the Biden administration, she was surveilled on multiple flights, with air marshals tracking her as though she were some kind of threat. Internal records even showed her official congressional portrait, meaning the authorities knew exactly who she was. This was not a mistake. It was a deliberate choice to monitor a political opponent. If this can happen to someone of her stature, what chance does the average American have? And it did happen to average Americans. We learned of a Catholic school teacher from Texas, a woman with no criminal history, no extremist ties, and no record of violence. Her supposed crime? Attending a rally in Washington to show her support for President Trump. She never entered the Capitol. Her phone data proved it, and facial recognition did not place her there. Yet the FBI labeled her a domestic terrorist. For 2 years, her family was watched and harassed when they traveled. That is not justice. That is not national security. That is political persecution. What is most troubling is the way the system was manipulated to justify this surveillance. The First Amendment protects free speech and political expression, and yet federal agencies treated those rights as grounds for suspicion. Attending a rally, questioning COVID mandates, or even removing a mask on an airplane became enough to land people on a government watch list. This is unconstitutional, plain and simple. The abuses extended even further. Records showed that 3 sitting members of Congress, all Republicans, were subjected to surveillance under companion programs. These were not fringe activists or dangerous criminals. These were elected officials and decorated military members. Their only real offense was standing on the wrong side of the political divide. What makes this more insidious is the way outside institutions were used to skirt accountability. The Department of Homeland Security funded a university project on extremism. That project compiled reports on January 6 defendants and passed them back to DHS, which then used those reports as justification for adding people to watch lists. In some cases, that was the only evidence used. By outsourcing the dirty work, the administration tried to create plausible deniability while still targeting political opponents. Now here is where constructive criticism of the Democratic Party is important. Democrats often present themselves as defenders of civil liberties, as champions of a constitution. Yet when in power, too many of them turned a blind eye to these abuses. By allowing agencies to use vague authorities and broad definitions of extremism, they opened the door to surveillance based on political belief rather than criminal conduct. If Democrats truly care about protecting democracy, they should be the first to condemn this. Instead, they defended it, stonewalled investigations, and mocked concerns as conspiracy theories. That is a betrayal not just of conservatives, but of every American who values freedom. Thankfully, with new leadership at the Department of Homeland Security, these programs are being dismantled. Bureaucratic roadblocks are being cleared away, and transparency is finally being prioritized. But the work is not finished. We must demand full accountability. Every official who approved surveillance of Americans for exercising their constitutional rights should be held responsible. The public deserves to know exactly how many people were targeted, why they were targeted, and who signed off on it. This is not about left or right. It is about freedom versus control. If political speech can be criminalized under one administration, then no American is safe when power changes hands. The principle must be clear. Our government exists to protect the people, not to punish them for dissent. So, as we continue exposing these abuses, I encourage you to stay informed, stay vocal, and never surrender your rights in the face of government intimidation. If they can do this to veterans, to teachers, and to sitting members of Congress, they can do it to anyone. The Constitution was written to prevent exactly this kind of abuse, and it is our responsibility as citizens to make sure those safeguards remain strong. Thank you for listening, and once again, make sure you like and subscribe to the channel. Together, we will keep holding those in power accountable and defend the values that make this nation free.